Hugh Kelly from Volta Networks. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you. Great to be here.
Good to have you with us, Hugh. Tell us, how does Volta see the role of cloud as it relates to telecom networks and 5G?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that cloud will play a very important role in 5G. And I think that is really true in two senses. If you look at 5G standards, you're seeing all of the basic functions, say what was the remote radio head and BBU in 4G is now broken up into multiple virtual functions, the radio unit, the distributed unit, the control unit, right? So it's a heavily virtualized environment. Virtualization is really served very well by cloud-like infrastructure, right? Cloud is a great way to scale processing, and it's certainly the most cost-effective. So we see that as being important. So the service providers will have to leverage processing relatively close to the customer. But there's also, interestingly, a revenue opportunity in things like multi-access edge computing, or MEC, right? And that's very tightly integrated with the 5G standards. And it really creates a revenue opportunity for the service providers to provide compute services, whether that's cloud-like in terms of platform as a service or as infrastructure as a service. Their enterprise customers are going to need that for the next generation of services like ultra-reliable, low-latency communications, things like connected cars, smart cities, industrial automation, telemedicine. So cloud will be very integral both in terms of services as well as the infrastructure. And so virtualization is really enabled by a lot of that, and we think that's critically important.
What sort of technical challenges do you think the cloud can solve for operators, Hugh?
Well, I think if you start to look at some of the applications in 5G, right, routing has been somewhat resistant to virtualization. Big legacy routers generally are monolithic entities, and we've seen that carry forward even in some open networking, like network operating systems running on white box switches. But there are applications that are very important to 5G. So let me give you a couple of examples. One is RAN sharing, right? We're going to see a lot more small cell sites. That's very expensive from a CapEx standpoint. And as a result, a number of operators are looking at ways that they can share that infrastructure. Well, if you have two different operators with different services, different management organizations trying to run the same infrastructure, separating those immediately into two virtual routers would be a great way to be able to facilitate that and leverage virtualization in that process. Longer term, things like network slicing, where you're going to have kind of these virtual services running on top of the common 5G infrastructure, a lot of that will be enabled by spinning up new virtual instances. And so if you can extend that into routing, then that really becomes a very powerful tool. And the cloud is really a way to enable that.
Hugh, this sounds very appealing, but I mean, really, how hard is it for operators to actually integrate the cloud into their networks? What kind of changes does it require? How long does this transformation take generally?
Well, it's going to be a long-term process, but I think one of the big advantages for service providers, particularly when you're looking at it from our perspective in terms of the transport network for the radio access portion of the network, all those new cell sites, all those new fiber connections, all those routers, while there'll be a lot more of them, it's a greenfield build-out. So we're seeing operators now, we're members of the Telecom Infra Project. It's really an operator-led and driven organization setting up standards like disaggregated cell site gateway, which is a project to have open networking to service that portion of the network. It's really a way to build out that ecosystem. And so, the embrace of open standards will help a great deal. But I think that scale is also something that service providers need to think about, right? If you've got 2 orders of magnitude more routers than you're used to managing, really then you're in a situation where you can say, I really need to start automation. And so embracing standards like APIs, NetCom, Yang service models, that's the way to be able to keep the operating costs relatively low and make those services profitable. And so I think also you need to look at it and say, can I start to embrace cloud native applications, right? Applications that were literally built for the cloud. Sometimes we think of that as being, that just means you were containerized. That's a portion of it, but it really means, can you run on a scalable cloud infrastructure? Because if you're really trying to leverage the lower cost processing available in the cloud, and let's face it, routing control planes are very processor and memory intensive. That's the least costly way to do it. And therefore, you have a lot of advantages if you want to build out virtualization in your network. And I think the applications are really going to require that.
So lots of opportunity, lots of potential, obviously some more challenges to get there. What else do you think needs to be done, Hugh, to kind of really accelerate the transformation to this cloud-driven world?
Right. Well, I think we've mentioned a couple of things, right? More use of virtualization. Service providers just had a great example of that. Most of them point to the changes in their networks driven by the pandemic. They were able to respond to because so much of the network had already been virtualized. Second, a more approach that's open networking, where, let's face it, 5G is not going to be a one-size-fits-all. It's going to be a mix-and-match world. And being able to cooperate and tell the vendors what the service providers themselves want through organizations like TIP, those are all great ways to be able to accommodate that.
Hugh, thank you very much for your insight. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.